Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mohi. My name is Rachel Spence, and I am the Public Programs Manager here. For low or no vision audience members, I'm a white woman with red hair and a ponytail, wearing a black dress with daisies on it and a black cardigan. Thank you so much for coming out on what we know is a very rainy and traffic-filled evening. And thank you to those of you who end up joining us through live stream or are going to watch this in the future on our YouTube channel. Tonight, Seattle Disability Activism History is a partnership between Mohi and the Seattle Department of Neighborhoods. As an important welcome into this space, we encourage you to take care of your needs during the program. The bathrooms are down that hallway and on the left. And there is a bar in the back, which some of you may have found, that has drinks and snacks for purchases. Please feel free to get up and move if you need to during the program, and there's also space to stand if you would rather stand in the back. As we ground into the space, it's important to acknowledge that here at Mohi, we are on the historic and contemporary lands and waters of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and all Coast Salish people. Historically, Native communities were forcibly removed from the city, but today we honor their continued endurance with deep respect and gratitude for their stewardship of this place. And now I am going to turn the mic over to our amazing partners at the Seattle Department of Neighborhoods, more specifically Michael DeLange, who is a neurodivergent historian and city planner who has worked for the state historic preservation offices in Hawaii and Oregon before coming to Seattle and the Department of Neighborhoods. So let's give a round of applause.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm a short, brown guy with a little bit of gray in his beard and a blue corduroy suit with a plaid shirt on. And I'll describe our first slide here. It says Seattle Disability Activism History, and it has Mohi's logo, and then the logo of the department that I work for, the Department of Neighborhoods. And then there's an image from Mohi's collection of folks in mobility devices picketing in front of Metro, the transportation provider, and the sign says, "Save our bus, Center Park." Remember that name, Center Park will come up again. That's right, I have to do it this way. Oh, there we go. Okay. I always like to do a little roadmap and set expectations. I get fidgety if I'm sitting in a presentation and I don't know what's going to happen, so I like to do that for audiences. So what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about my department and a disability history report that we want to grant to write. And then I'm going to show you some of the people that worked on the project for us. And I'm going to share some of the places and people that we learned about in the research that we were doing. It's going to be very, very cursory. It's going to be just quick hits. But hopefully it'll be enough to entice you to look at the document, and then I'll also offer some resources that are accessible if you are interested in doing your own research. And then I'll, very briefly, talk about what might come next, and then I'll introduce a panel of folks that helped us with the project. The folks that are sitting here, you'll finally get to find out who they are. So, but until then, sit with the mystery. Okay, so I work for the Department of Neighborhoods, but I work specifically in the Historic Preservation Program. And our mandate is preserving and perpetuating, there were some other adjectives, I'm not sure what it is, the heritage and history of the city. And the way that we do that is through a landmark program. If you've heard of Seattle landmarks, we have more than 400. And in this slide, there's some, it says Historic Preservation Program, and then there's some dead space. And that is because I can never come up with a single image that really encapsulates the entire program and all of the work that we do. You've probably heard of the Space Needle. That's a landmark. You can imagine the Space Needle there. The building that we're in right now was a naval facility. This is a landmark. Some of the ships outside are landmarks. There's bridges and steam plants. Our goal is to tell the entire history of the city through places. It's not just single sites. We also do that through historic districts. We manage 8 historic districts. The most famous is probably Pike Place Market. You can imagine Pike Place Market in that empty space, but also Ballard, the International District, Columbia City, and several others. And we have a survey which has thousands of properties, a little bit of information on properties throughout the city. We use that for our work in determining if a development project might be impacting a historic place, but we share that with the public. And soon we will have very exciting news about effort to make that much more accessible and interesting. I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. The program has existed for 60 years. I haven't worked there for 60 years, but we're very proud of the work that we've done. It was one of the first historic preservation programs in the country, but like all institutions, the work in our past was really focused on dominant history and dominant cultures, people who had money and means to compel us to make landmarks. I think when people think of a sort of stereotype of what a landmark is, they often think of some rich guy's house. And from all the examples that I talked about before, we know that's not all we talk about. But that reputation in the field is not completely undeserved. In the last few decades, thankfully, there's been a lot of organizing, particularly in communities of color, to get properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places or as local landmarks. There's been a lot of, in the last decade and a half, organizing within the LGBTQ community toward projects like ours and listing on the National Register. We're very serious about being a partner and being proactive in our work to make sure that the work that we do is inclusive. Our mandate is to perpetuate and preserve and share and honor the history of the whole city. And so in thinking about how to do that, we thought about, I'll move my slide. For Culture actually made things somewhat easy for us. For Culture, the culture and arts organization that is at the county. They, in the last 10 years, done reports about what's missing within historic preservation, where the gaps are in landmarks and with the National Register and in approaches. And one of the takeaways from that was that there were no landmarks that had anything to do with disability history, at least not as their primary reason for being listed as a landmark. So 400 plus landmarks, none of them had to do with disability history. That's not rare in other cities and in the national program, the National Register of Historic Places. And so we thought, let's be proactive and do a grant project that works in the least served community so that we can maybe get the ball rolling on bigger things later, starting a model or creating a model for other cities to use. The grant that we won to do this project is a grant that's really accessible for small communities and any communities that are doing historic preservation work. There's also work at the national level that's being done that's sort of in its beginning phases, and we're hoping that completing a project, making the mistakes that a first project makes, we could offer up some roadmap for that project. We decided specifically within disability history to focus on activism because the touches that historic preservation as a field has had with disability history have mostly been places that were, that folks were working with because of the architecture of the place and not because of the people that were there, at least primarily. And often those were places that people were sent to. We wanted to focus on activism because it put the focus on the community's agency to affect change And so that was our starting place for the work and the research that we did. And I think we went a little beyond just, the immediate things that you think of as activism into organizing. But I think it was useful to have that as a starting point. Whoop. And I want to go back to the slide. I like to share this image that is on the slide of, it is a parchment paper. You can tell it's old-timey because it's got kind of curly Q handwriting. It's very difficult to read, but it says, "To the Honorable City Council." And this is a petition from Mr., I think, J.S. Light, who, I won't use the terms that they used then, is a person that had a disability and whose community was petitioning to allow him to sell things. I like to include this just because it says something that I think everyone in this room knows, is that as long as there's been a Seattle, there have been people living and working, creating lives and history in this city that had disabilities. So the report that we did, we got the grant to write, it's called a historic context study. And I'll do a description here of the slide. There's an image that is not necessarily relevant to historic context study. I just really love this image. I think it's a really beautiful image. It's one of Mohai's. It's of a woman standing in a printed dress, looking out the window, or standing in front of the window with light coming in. It's from a sheltered workshop that organization put together for the employment of folks with low vision and who are blind. But I really, that photo always kind of captured my imagination, so I wanted to put it in. You can see the brooms that are made in the factory. So historic context study. It's just a written history, really basically. And it makes it easier to understand what's significant about a place or an event or a person that is a part of a history. It is specifically geared toward the National Register of Historic Places. That's how we were able to get the grant, and that's the kind of like system that it works within. But it's not its only use. It is really focused on place-based history. That is kind of a limiting factor in what's written. But it's also useful as sort of a general organizing document. So if you're writing a National Register nomination for a site, you'll have a little bit of contextual information about how that site might fit into a history, whether it's in the report or whether the reason that thing is significant is detailed in the report. It doesn't designate any given properties. It has no kind of legal standing. And it's not definitive history, and I feel like that's something I really want to underline, is this isn't the last word in history. We're not projecting it at that. I'm hoping that it's the beginning of a conversation. But that historic context study model is just something that we had to do to get the grant working with the National Register system. So I moved on to the next slide here. We have 3 images of 3 folks. I did not write this. I wrote little bits of it. We hired 3 historians, and on the right there's a photo of a woman with a lovely smile and blonde hair. That's Laura LePink. She was with the University of Minnesota and is part of a collective that is one of the few groups that's doing work with disability history and historic preservation at that intersection. She's a public historian. She's written National Register nominations about the person on the next slide, just as a preview. As well as many others. In the center, there's older, Gail's gonna kill me for calling her older, older than Laura woman with head wrap on and glasses. That's Dr. Gail Dubrow. She is a professor at University of Minnesota, but she has a long history here in Seattle. She was the head of the historic preservation program at the University of Washington for years, and has is well-deserved reputation as someone who has spent the last few decades trying to really expand definitions of what fit into our field, writing feminist histories and histories of people of color, and has just started in the last few years doing work in this space at the intersection of disability and historic preservation. The last person is a person with a little smirk and plaid shirt and a kind of swoop hair. That's Morgan Lacasse. Morgan is, I think, very busy right now. They're the graphic designer for the report. We just got our final text finished today, and it's sent off to Morgan, and Morgan is going to make sure that it is beautiful and accessible, and get all of the images and everything formatted so we can share it with you. So, I talked about the report. What did we find? It's 200 pages, so in the couple of minutes that I have, it's going to be very difficult to go into a lot of great depth. I organized this around firsts. This is the first historic context study any community has ever done about disability history. And so I thought I'd pull out some firsts. Firsts aren't the most important thing in history. They're not the only thing that's important, but they're eye-catching. So our first is this gentleman. I've switched slides, and there's an image of a black and white image from the 19th century of a gentleman with a white tie on and a kind of walrus mustache and little glasses. And that is Olaf Hansen. Olaf Hansen was the first licensed deaf architect in America and worked here in Seattle. He got his start in Minnesota, which was a happy accident since we hired people from Minnesota, and started his career there and came out to work at a firm here and eventually had a job with UW. His house in the U District was a kind of natural organizing space. He actually had a few different houses and offices for deaf advocacy groups, but also, social things, weddings. Part of how I know that is skipping down. His wife, Agatha, and he founded a newspaper for the deaf community in Seattle, or the deaf community in the Northwest, actually, called the Northwest Observer. It was published from throughout the early 1900s, and is online and accessible. So if you want to learn more about deaf history in Seattle specifically at that time, this is an amazing resource that Gallaudet University has made available. It's another place that he worked. He was also an early force in the Puget Sound Association for the Deaf, PSAD. It was an organization that started with advocacy around employment access and branched out to many different things. It was unique at the time, at the turn of the century, because it was organized by people from the community for their own needs. I think the image of the woman at the sheltered workhouse, that's more representative of the type of the organizations that were doing care that were sort of on the charity model. So on the topic of the organizing for the community, next topic, before we get to our next first, this is Ida Daly. There is a black and white image of a woman in a mobility device, a powered chair. She's wearing a pantsuit. You know it's the 50s because she's got cat eye glasses on and a beautiful little brooch. Ida, there may be people in this room that have worked with Ida Daly. I seem to run into people who remember her everywhere I go. She did a lot. She was a nationally and internationally recognized figure in disability advocacy. She founded the Handicap Center in 1951 and was really focused on creating organizations that were funded by the community for the community's needs, and the leadership in the organization was from the community. by complete happenstance, UW actually didn't even know this. They have all of the newsletters of that organization in special collections. That's where I got this image from. And it's an amazing resource to really get into the day-to-day of people that were associated with the Handicap Center, from weddings and birthday parties, but also the issues of the time. And there was one issue that came up over and over and over for the first decade of the existence of the group, and that was the need for accessible housing as a kind of foundational and primary need for people in the community. And I switched slides. So there's two images. The one on the left is a huge sign. It's a black and white image. It says, "Future site of Center Park Apartments for the Handicap." And then under it, there's three folks. On the left is Ida, and the other two gentlemen were with the Handicap Center. It feels a little flip to just kind of go through all of this advocacy so quickly. There was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears put into advocating at the local, state, and national level to create a housing project, which is the photo on the right. There's an image, a hand-drawn image, an architectural drawing of a building that still exists, Center Park, which is down in South Seattle. I've switched slides. There's an image on the left of a brutalist building with brick and projecting concrete balconies and voids and mass. You can tell I'm an architectural historian. And a big concrete plinth out in front. Center Park was the first public housing project in America that was specifically designed for people with disabilities. And I think further important, it was designed by Paul Kirk, who is an architect of some renown in the area, but also, and as a modernist, I love Kirk's work. But Kirk had polio as a child and had mobility issues his entire life. He's actually known for including ramps in a lot of his public buildings, as much for architecture as accessibility, and thinking of that as a concern. So that experience and those sensitivities, I'm sure, is why they brought him in. He actually designed the original Handicap Center headquarters. So in Center Park, there's a building that was designed by a person with disabilities because of the advocacy of people with disabilities for people from the community. And as an accessible building, it became a natural meeting place for the community. And in doing the research of all the various organizations that had existed, there ends up being kind of a node around Center Park, which I think makes sense. So I've switched slides. Gail and Laura did a lot of research on the intersections between the disability organizing and advocacy community and the mid-century, like the late century or last century LGBTQ organizing, and then later organizing with HIV/AIDS, people suffering from HIV/AIDS and the people that cared about them. There's a lot of overlap. It's like one of the more interesting chapters, and it leads to one of our other firsts, which is Bailey Boucher House, which again, it feels. I don't feel great about going through this history very quickly. It is detailed even more in the report, and there are really amazing videos that Virginia Mason put up on their YouTube in 2014 or so that really go into detail about how the community had to fight the neighborhood and the medical establishment to create this place to provide compassionate and care that was geared toward people with HIV/AIDS. So yeah, if you're online, you can open up a browser tab and go, but you can watch the rest of this. There was another organization, POCAN, which was really amazing, the People of Color Against AIDS Network, which is a kind of consortium of various advocacy groups. As another amazing history, MOHI actually did a panel about their history. So I won't go into that much detail. You can check that out. And they also have an entire subsection within the report. So I have one more slide after this, but I just wanted to say thank you. In this slide, there's an image of folks square dancing in wheelchairs from the Handicap Center from the 1950s. I love this photo. This is people enjoying themselves. If you're interested in reading the report, we just got the final text. You can Google Seattle disability history, and it should be the first thing that comes up if this event isn't the first step. Or you can find it on disability history, or the Department of Neighborhood's website. I want to say thank you to the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. They're the ones that gave us the grant to do the project, and the National Park Service. They're the ones that gave them the grant so they would have the money to give it to us. So I have to say thank you to both of them. They're getting the bills paid. And then I have my information here. So my name is Michael DeLange, spelled like Michael DeLange, DELANGE at seattle.gov. I'm hoping to, like I said, I don't want this to be the last word. I hope it's the beginning of a conversation. I want to stay in touch with people who are interested in the project and maybe what we do next. Which gets me to my last slide, outcomes and next steps. So we're going to have the final text report. The final report text is available now. We're going to have the final with all of the images and everything graphically designed in a couple of weeks. It'll have a list of properties that the historian thought were significant. Again, not definitive, but maybe enough to start a conversation. A National Register or Seattle Landmark nomination could come out of this. It would take community support for that to happen. I think it's not a instant process, but it is kind of the organization of the report, but not the only good thing that could come out of it. There's going to be online story maps that share the history in an accessible way and tell stories about the history that we found and based on places. I know that that's going to happen because I'm going to do that. And then the historians, Gail and Laura, they made a number of recommendations, but one of them is a working group of interested community members who are interested in this history and maybe interested in seeing further work in that intersection between historic preservation and disability history, whether that's writing a nomination, whether that's other ways of sharing the history. So don't be bashful, get in touch. I'm not quite sure what the shape of that might look like now, but I think there's a little bit of support that we could provide that getting off the ground. And then we had a storytelling project that ran simultaneously to this, to the research that the historians were doing. And hoping to get some histories and stories that kind of are outside the confines of what that bureaucratic and academic text would require, and get people to tell their stories. And this is a great place to wrap up because Colin Wilfred was one of the people that organized the story gathering. So we hope to continue doing that in the next year or so as we discover stories that maybe are important to share but didn't make it into the report. So with that, I want to introduce Colin. Colin is a recent graduate from the University of Oregon. Go Ducks, quack, quack.
Yeah.
With a major in political, I went to U of O too, with a major in political science and a minor in disability studies. Colin has autism and has served in leadership for the Accessibility Student Union and was also a member of the Quelo Law Fellowship program that works to increase representation in the legal profession. Next to Colin is Elizabeth Ralston. Elizabeth's a consultant who guides organizations in the strategic development of accessibility roadmaps. She's also the founder of the Cultural Accessibility Consortium, a grassroots effort to help arts and cultural organizations improve their accessibility for audiences, and was a great help with the project. Next to Elizabeth is Michelle Baca. Michelle is a recent graduate of the Masters of Urban Planning program at University of Washington. She also has a background in historic preservation and disability studies, and a background in working on senior living software and consulting, and is an independent researcher. She's hoping to enrich place experience and conserve place memory through built environment research and community building. And the last person is Carol Rosmolsky. She's an accessibility coach and strategic advisor with 20 years of experience helping organizations create more inclusive and accessible environments. She is a Gen Xer and predates the Americans with Disability Act, and is focused on using, strength of relationships to guide accessibility consulting, and funny stories. She's good. She's a gas. And with that, we'll have a panel about the relationship between disability activism and history, and I'll let Colin take it over.
All right. Too many people believe we are broken and need to be fixed. Too many people believe we need people without disabilities to save us. Too many people see disability as a bad thing that they wish never happens to themselves. Too many people assume that we cannot do the same things they do, such as living on our own and graduating from college. Too much media depicts us in a negative light as people that the audience should never want to become. All these social norms are some of the most noteworthy examples of ableism in the United States. If anything could change about the interactions with people with and without disabilities have with each other, then perhaps people without disabilities could benefit from changing their own attitudes. Perhaps they can begin to understand that our disabilities are just part of who we are. Perhaps they can begin to listen to us and respect what we believe we need to succeed. Perhaps they can learn to look at us less for our disabilities and more for our personalities and interests. Perhaps they can realize that we can do the same things as people without disabilities. We just need reasonable accommodations to help us along the way. Perhaps movies and TV shows will begin to depict us in ways that make us feel seen. Perhaps when someone joins the disability community, they will understand that ableism is holding us back and join the fight to stop it rather than think their lives of happiness are over. When these good attitudes are expressed towards people with disabilities, it becomes evident that disability activism has successfully been used to combat ableism. All four of us on this panel tonight have seen ableism at its worst, as well as how successful disability activism has been at changing the attitudes of people without disabilities from negative to positive. As it turns out, people with disabilities can achieve their desired goals, and they are counting on people without disabilities to not get in their way. So, without further ado, let's begin our panel. All right, so what is your experience around disability and disability activism?
I guess I should start. My name is Elizabeth Ralston, and I'm a white woman with short wavy silver hair, and I'm wearing a blue dress with black and white geometric shapes that my captioner said reminded her of cells with the organs in them. Sort of. Really pleased to be here today. I guess I was born deaf, and used hearing aids my whole life, and then within the last 10, 15 years, I got cochlear implants, which greatly increased my access to sound. And I guess my experience with disability activism had to do with actually when I first moved to Seattle. Because all my life I was mainstreamed. I didn't go to school for the deaf. My parents were not interested in having me sign, and so I was a passer of sorts. I sort of flew under the wire, trying to fit in like everyone else, and had a lot of internalized ableism as a result. And it wasn't until I came to Seattle, and actually before that, when the ADA was passed in 1990, I was in the Peace Corps in Africa, and I was so excited about the ADA because it meant that maybe finally I can talk on the phone by myself without my mother helping me make phone calls to maybe potential boyfriends or whatever. And then I went to graduate school, and I used captioning for the first time in my life. In college, I had nothing. I had maybe note takers. I would ask people if they could take notes for me, but that was the extent of my accommodations. And then the ADA was passed, and then I went to graduate school and got captioning, and I aced all my classes. Not that I didn't fail in college, but I did much better in graduate school. And then I moved to Seattle, and at that time, this was back in the mid-1990s, captioning was just starting to come out in the theaters. And I decided we need to have captioning in Seattle. And so I worked with a group of people, and we called ourselves Caption Seattle. And we got captioning to the Cinerama, which was then called the Cinerama, now the downtown Shift Theater, whatever it's called. And from there it spread to most of the movie theaters. So I'll stop there. I could go on, but I'll let my fellow panelists have a turn.
Hey everyone, I'm Michelle. I'm a white woman with long brown hair and 2 braids, wearing all black with a long skirt, pink birds. So my experience with disability is I grew up with strabismus, which is it's a cranial nerve malfunction in which both eyes don't look in the same direction at the same time. It's pretty common in folks on the spectrum. And a lot of people hear it being referred to as lazy eye. That's actually how I referred to it most of my life. I just thought I had a lazy eye. It wasn't until I was 30 that I heard that word, strabismus, rather got that diagnosis, strabismus. And then it wasn't even until a couple years after that when I started taking disability studies courses that I started to really personally identify with disability and disability activism. Pass it.
Hi, I'm Carol. Nice to be here. Colin, that introduction was fire. Is that the right word? Fire? Yeah. All right. I want to follow up with what Elizabeth said with where were you when the ADA passed? I'm glad to be old enough to remember that. I was at the University of Washington, and interestingly enough, I was involved in a protest on campus, and we were advocating for the creation of a ramp between Red Square and Drumheller Fountain. I'm sure there's enough folks here from the area that know the campus, and you know if you don't use that big stairway there, you have to go all the way around to get to South Campus. And quite frankly, that was a pain in the ass. And so we were advocating for there to be a discreet, tasteful wheelchair ramp along the side of Suzzallo Library. So to get our point across, a number of disabled students, most of them wheelchair users like myself. Pardon me, I did not offer my visual description. I am a wheelchair user. I'm wearing a scratchy purple sweater, and I have tortoiseshell glasses on and some amazing red lipstick. So hopefully that's a good enough description. So we formed a blockade along that stairway during the middle of the day. And we asked ambulatory people to go around that day. People were pretty frustrated with us, and they didn't quite understand what the big deal was. So luckily, though, a KG reporter from the Daily connected the dots between the EDA and what we were doing. And they asked us how we thought the EDA would change our lives. And we were pretty optimistic, but guarded, because my experience with education, and the same was probably true for some of the other students, is we had to advocate every step of the way. I'm old enough that not every kid who was in elementary school was mainstreamed in what we would call regular classes. And I was the great experiment of the Issaquah School District. I was the first child in a wheelchair to be mainstreamed at my junior high and my high school. And each step required a large amount of advocacy. I even had to advocate for getting on stage at my graduation. And that really solidified my understanding that disability justice and activism is a lifelong commitment, and one that we don't get to run away from.
All right, this is Colin. I'm wearing a black mask, a blue button-down shirt, and black slacks. Tell us how you became disability activists, or do you even see yourself that way?
Should we go down the other way this time? Well, Elizabeth and I were chatting before the panel today, and the conversation came up of, are we big A activists or are we little a activists? And that's a real conundrum that I think a lot of us wrestle with. But to simply answer the question, I would say yes, I am an activist. Not to show off the fact that I was protesting in college. My understanding is that it's what you're supposed to do in college. But, and who knows what we have in the future around protests, but I digress. But yes, I mean, activism is a daily activity. It doesn't ever really go away. But because I'm smarter and older now, I feel like I infiltrate different spaces. And I'm sneaky about my activism because I just show up. And then people go, okay, what are we going to do? And then I say, well, let me tell you, we can talk about it and work it out. And that's where relationships and partnerships come into play. None of us get to where we are on our own. And I think that living with a disability has taught me that our culture really promotes this false sense of independence that can be really harmful. And it does have some ableist nuances to it. But the harm is not just specific to people with disabilities. It's to anybody who's experiencing a struggle. So I say yes, I'm an activist, and I do what I do, not just for myself, but for everybody who struggles.
I'll add, this is Michelle. I also struggle a little bit with the word activist. It feels like a really big, grand title, but it's something that I am committed to, especially as I'm starting to get into the work of historic preservation and writing and researching. I think activism is going to become a really big part of my work, something that I want to get through in the things that I write. So yeah, it's something that I grapple with, and the big A, little a thing is very relatable, but I think it's just it's a mindset day to day. It's every personal interaction. It comes up in small places and in big places, and it's just something that I've committed myself to. Yeah, I think I'll take the title.
I think Carol has convinced me that I'm an activist. Even though I never really saw myself as an activist, I saw myself as an advocate and a relationship builder and an educator and a connector. And that's how I see activism happening. Because like you said, Michelle, it feels like a grand title. It feels like, we're up on stage and fighting for something and, making grand speeches and things. I never really saw myself that way. I saw myself as sort of working in the background, kind of making things happen with the community because you can't do it all alone. And because I'm an arts lover, I grew up with a very musical family, and my parents took me everywhere. They took me to theater, musicals, and so on and so forth. And there were no captions, nothing. And so I relied on a script. And so I endured a lot of ableism doing that because people would tell me, please turn the flashlight off. And I'm using a tiny pen light. And I'm going like this and trying to see the words. And I'm trying to be unobtrusive. And so through that experience, I realized that there's a lot of inequity in access in the arts because the art spaces are a lot of them are very historic, right? We have the Paramount Theater, we have a whole bunch of beautiful theaters that are made for non-disabled people. And so I started thinking about, well, how can we make this more equitable for people with disabilities across the board? And so I founded the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium as a way to get people together and learn about how to make spaces and places and events more accessible to people with disabilities. So I guess that's a kind of activism.
All right. Do you think disability history has been overlooked in Seattle and the United States?
Start. So, as I've been saying, I'm doing this work in historic preservation. So the way that I've really been learning about Seattle over these past few years is through landmark nominations and different documentation like that. And Mike even mentioned it during his intro, For Cultures, the work they've done. I've gotten to intern with them last summer, and I inherited this big spreadsheet, of all the Seattle and King County landmarks and looking for associations with underrepresented communities. And even those interns that worked on that spreadsheet prior to me weren't always necessarily looking for disability as part of that underrepresented communities. So that was something that I brought into that study, and something that I'm continuing to do is just looking at these different nominations, finding the gaps, either where disability isn't engaged or it's not really engaged in like a thorough, holistic way, and hopefully starting to rewrite some of those histories too.
I think that disability is overlooked in general, in almost every facet of life: arts, health, education, and so on and so forth. Let's take the pandemic for an example. How did the information reach disability communities? How did people get to vaccination clinics? I have a public health background, so I'm always thinking with that lens of health and equity. And so I worked with the public health department to get messaging out to disability communities, particularly the deaf community and the blind community, because how is information going to get to these communities in an equitable way? And so I think a group of people got together during the pandemic and formed something called the King County Disability Consortium, and they meet every month, and they talk about things like exactly this issue of bringing things to the forefront of state government, city government, to try and get policies and procedures in place for people with disabilities?
I would say yes, it is often overlooked. As to why, I think disability tends to be nested in the narrative of other stories. And we don't recognize how disability forward a particular story might be. And so, as somebody that holds stories, I don't always know what people know and what they don't know. And when I get asked to talk at events, I'm often at a conundrum about what's going to hold interest for people. What are people going to connect with? Because something that I think is boring might be like really revolutionary for somebody. I don't want to diminish that experience of learning for somebody, but I have to understand what's mundane and predictable for me may be really unfamiliar and scary for other people. And so I welcome the opportunity to use history as a means of revealing those things.
All right. How can the ways in which disability history and activism are represented in society be improved upon?
Can I start with this one?
Please do.
How much time do we have? So for this one, I really had to kind of go to my favorites list. In the ADA, there's a lot of preconditions as to when you are protected and when you are not protected from discrimination. In particular, the employment title of the ADA extends protection to qualified people with disabilities. Well, how do you know if I'm qualified or not? Isn't there a lot of implicit bias that could influence whether or not somebody thinks I'm qualified or not? When I go into a job interview and I'm driving in my power wheelchair, I'm queuing up a lot of biases. I know that. So I would like to see discrimination be prohibited, period. Let me apply. Let me not have to rest on preconditions. So that's one. Another one that I have is who gets to decide if I'm disabled or not? Well, according to the ADA, if I need a reasonable accommodation, I need a doctor to declare that I am disabled and that my disability impacts the accommodation that I'm asking for. Well, I go to a clinic, and sometimes the doctor that I talk to has only known me for 15 minutes. Are they qualified to say whether or not I'm disabled? I'm 53 years old, and I've been disabled since birth. I think my point of view ought to have more value than a stranger's opinion that I met for 15 minutes. And lastly, I would say that when we are working on activism, we need to stop thinking about disability as being an outlier in terms of civil rights. The introduction to this event identified that 1 in 4 people in the world have a disability, and we are a very welcoming group. At some point, if you live long enough, you may become a part of our community. I hope you have a long life. The disability part, you can pick and choose for yourself whether or not you want that. It might add some depth and texture to your life experience, but I don't think of that as a requirement. But really, we need to see disability as being central to creating a healthy and thriving community where we allow access and diversity to flourish. So those are my big 3. Mic drop.
How am I going to follow that?
It's all yours.
I think really that disability is the largest minority that anyone can join. It's the only minority that anyone can join at any time.
Anytime.
Anytime.
Come on down.
And exactly. And businesses and organizations need to be planning for this because we hold a large stream of revenue for these organizations, and they need to start thinking about how to draw these audiences in, how to get these people to bank their power with them. The ADA has been around for over 30 years. Where has it gotten us? Yes, there have been improvements. However, the ADA is the basement. I call it the basement. We need to go way above and beyond the ADA to make our spaces more welcoming and inclusive to everyone. And so, and this goes across employment. The hiring process, for example, like Carol was saying so well, make your hiring practices, your language, and your job interviews welcoming and inclusive, and don't make any assumptions about what we can and can't do. And I would also like to say curricula needs to really be changed in schools, for example, in medical schools, in universities. There's a lot of medicalized ableism. So when you show up at your doctor's office, as Carol was saying, there's a lot of discrimination and prejudice against people with disabilities because of the medical model. You go in there and you need to be fixed, as opposed to seeing that society is the barrier itself. What else? I think I could go on and on, but I think people with disabilities need to be invited to the table. Nothing about us without us. I know it's a familiar refrain, but it really means start building relationships. We don't bite, okay? We are people too. Maybe she does, I don't know.
Sometimes, yeah.
So, so invite us to the tables. If you're making policies, if you're creating programs, find out what we like, because we are people too. We want to have fun, we enjoy the outdoors, we enjoy the arts, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think just building off of ADA as a bare minimum, I think a big part of that is, and what I try to do in my activism is really advocate for a more expansive understanding of what accessibility really is, especially like in the built environment circles. I've taken architecture classes, and there is this focus on ADA, and even more so, it's a focus on architectural barriers. But I think that it's important to realize there's so many more barriers to engaging with the world, with preservation, with all of that beyond just these physical things. I think also because, preservation tends to be my focus, I think there's a big opportunity to open up archives and sort of expand on some of these histories that we're already praising and aware of. One example that I've been looking at a lot lately, was part of my capstone at UW, is the Naval Hospital Chapel, which is up in Shoreline. And the site was developed originally as a naval hospital for World War II. It went on to become a tuberculosis clinic, and now it's a residential rehabilitation center for intellectually and developmentally disabled community. And the focus of that nomination is really about World War II. It's sort of this nationalistic tone, and focusing on that one period of significance. There's just a few sentences about the decades of how that site's been used since. And I saw that really as an opportunity to advocate for deinstitutionalizing IDD care, like making people more aware of what's going on here. We're kind of bringing this site into the limelight by landmarking it, and there was a big piece of the story that was missing in that landmark nomination. So I think it's kind of exciting as a historian to know that those archives can be dug into. There's more story to tell, and yeah, that's what we need to do.
All right, and last question. Can you share ideas with the audience about how they can work with you or get involved with efforts to support disability activism?
I would love to meet you and chat with you about what you're interested in. I give a lot of presentations and training around ableism. And one of the things that I do is an activity that really makes people move from not really understanding what disability is about to kind of a light bulb of changing an attitude about who people with disabilities really are. And so I really enjoy storytelling. I really enjoy helping people think about what are some ways that I can engage people with disabilities in my organization, whether it's HR or programs or the arts or so on and so forth. Another way to get involved is to look up the Seattle Cultural Accessibility Consortium. Is seattlecac.org. And we do a lot of presentations and workshops around accessibility in the arts. And we would love panel speakers and experts and people just to come and share what it's like for you to try to participate in the arts but are facing barriers, or what are some successes if you're an organization in integrating accessibility within your organization. I would love to know about those options as well.
Some ideas I have about getting involved in disability activism is to vote, and to vote conscientiously, vote thinking not just about how representatives will impact you economically, but how representatives and elected officials forge the culture that we live in. The ADA came about as a bipartisan effort between Democrats and Republicans. Tom Harkin, a senator, was one of the drivers. Tom Harkin had a sibling who was deaf and sparked his interest in disability rights. Ted Kennedy and the Kennedy family had people in their family with disabilities that elevated their awareness. Our veteran community has done a lot to elevate what it means to fight for the rights of disabilities. So please, especially when we're still in November, consider how your vote has impact. I also challenge you to consider how you create a narrative around disability. Words have power. I recently saw a newscast talking about a man in Arizona who was detained by the police. He was a deaf individual who also had cerebral palsy. The reporter described him as suffering from cerebral palsy. He was actually at a convenience store buying a snack. People who are suffering don't worry about snacks. That's my understanding anyway. I would also embrace you to consider how you approach tough situations. Do you embrace your own creativity and your own problem solving? People with disabilities have to do that every day. We're highly creative and imaginative because we need that in order to navigate through life. You have that power too, but sometimes it can be scary to tap into that. So really connect with us and embrace that creativity and that growth.
Yeah, and I think it's really just about being open-minded, and like when we think about accessibility, it's about what people need. So it's actually just listening to people when they tell you what they need and accommodating when you can. but also being creative, like finding ways to make things work
Right.
when you're not sure.
And also the concept of universal design. What you do will benefit everyone, not just people with disabilities.
All right, I think unless there's any other questions, it's time now to open up for Q&A. And the way we do this is if you raise your hand, I will come around with a microphone, and that way we make sure that your voice is picked up and on our captions and on the sound recording. So even if you think you have the loudest voice possible, please let me bring the microphone to you.
One of the things that I have been thinking about recently is how we can have a greater integration of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities with the rest of the disability communities, because I see a big separation at this point, and I don't think it helps either of us, and I think we need to overcome that divide.
Oh, I didn't know if anyone wanted to comment on that first.
I agree with the woman who made that observation. One experience that I had when younger was to be a counselor at a camp for people with disabilities, and there seemed to be kind of a segregation between campers who had disabilities that impacted their learning and others who did not. And I always found that to be a little bit disappointing to see that we were doing among each other what we experience out in the world more broadly. And so I think there's always an opportunity to engage and ask and to lead with curiosity. People really understand their own experiences regardless of what their defined learning capacity happens to be. So we really need to create space for that.
I have a question, or I guess like kind of a framed question. I don't know if like the two concepts relate to each other. I was just kind of curious about the concept of like somebody mentioned like universal design and what that meant, and like what that meant for people who sort of need accessibility. And then the one question that I had that was just beyond that was like, just in general, if any of you had like one big change that you could make to, I don't know, just like the way we build or transport or any of those things, that could just make things just across the board just easier for everyone in general, like what would that be and why?
So universal design is the design of things that accommodate the largest number of people, to fit the largest number of people under a tent. So for example, an example I like to give is those good grips, potato peelers. They're really thick and they have ridges on the side. That was created by an engineer whose wife had very severe arthritis in her hand, and she couldn't grip a regular potato peeler very well. So he created this large, good grip potato peeler, and it turns out everybody loved them. Not just people with arthritis in their hand. It was just easier for a lot of people to use. And that's an example of universal design. And captaining is another example of universal design. Someone who is deaf benefits from captains, but also people who are neurodivergent often benefit from captains, and people who think that they have normal hearing, but they're actually losing their hearing little by little, but they're in denial. Captions benefit those people. And people who want to be on a bus and read captions on their videos, that's another example of universal design that benefits everybody. Does that help?
Yeah, I would suggest that we share more information about the environments that we host. I definitely, like, for me, like, the things that I care about are, like, what if I have to pee? I mean, that's real, right? The second thing is, like, well, what obstacles, what topography am I going to encounter getting to your building? Because there's a lot of broken sidewalks in Seattle. And what do I think my experience is going to be once I get there? So having access to the internet is really amazing in terms of sharing information. So with some small businesses that I've interacted with, I've coached them to say, hey, you're in a historic building and the accessible entrance is on the side. It's not the main entrance. You should post a photo of that entrance on your website so people can recognize it and know where to go. Also, universal design fits a lot of people, but it doesn't fit everybody. So sometimes knowing some alternatives that may be available for folks, like the restroom on this floor has the grab bar on the right. On the third floor, the grab bar is on the left-hand side. I happen to be a lefty, and sometimes that's more disabling than being in a wheelchair.
Going off what you said too, I think universal design, it's important. It's something to strive for, but it's like a best case that's actually not achievable, right? Nothing's truly universal. Yeah. Should every place really be for every person? But I think it's just basic things. It's like a larger stall in the bathroom. That's nice for everyone. Everyone likes to have a little extra space, you know? So it's just small things. If you make it accessible for one group, you're making it more accessible for everyone. Mm-hmm. And then the sidewalks, yeah, we got to fix that. That's another bare minimum ADA thing in this city.
Sidewalks.
Yeah. I think it's just really important to communicate on your website or in your materials the transportation routes that end up in front of your building and how you get in the building. The problem is so many organizations work on accessibility a little bit, but they don't talk about it. And so they expect people with disability to show up. But how can they show up if they don't know that their spaces or their programs are going to be accessible? So I say shout it from the mountaintops and let people know what you're doing.
I'm just curious about organizations and or companies. I work with the deaf, and when I do my own talks or programs, I invite my deaf friends, but sometimes the people at the organization will say, you know, interpreters are so expensive. And I'm just wondering if your places of business, do you have a fund that, or is that ADA covered in that you would have an accessibility fund to pay for interpreters, to pay for captioning?
I can speak for Mohai on this. The ADA does not give organizations money to make things accessible, unfortunately. And the way we were able to move towards having ASL interpretation and cart captioning was getting a grant through IMLS, thank you, Institute for Museum and Libraries. This was a few years ago, which is why it's not top of brain. But what we did basically is we got that grant. We had the grant money for a year. We made it clear to the rest of the institution how important this was and how we were building connections with communities that were using these services, and then we're able to get it written into the budget. But not all organizations can do that, and I wish there was a better way. I'll turn it back to the panelists, but I just wanted to give that example of what MOHI did.
Well, I'll just say that if any organization receives federal funding, then you are obligated under the ADA to pay for an interpreter. If you are a tiny organization and it provides an undue burden on that organization, then you're not liable to provide these accommodations. I do not have an ADA background, but there are some folks here who do have an ADA background and can better speak to the legalities around that.
Well, in respect to the problem or the perceived problem of not having enough resources to provide captioning or ASL interpretation, businesses, regardless of what they do, have overhead expenses that are either planned for or not planned for. And it's part of what you have to navigate as a business owner or a proprietor. And as Elizabeth stated, if you receive federal funding or even under the ADA, you may be exposing yourself to risk for not providing those things. This is where relationship and connection with community is really important, because you don't have to necessarily figure this out by yourself, but you need to be receptive to trying to work through the problem and seeing how you can get there. It's not going to be perfect right away. We know that. We're experts at imperfection, and we're not scared of it. But what we really appreciate is the demonstrated attempt to get there.
I can also add one other thing is if there's not enough buy-in from leadership of the organization, it's not going to happen. So really trying to build the case so that you can get that money put into the budget is a way to ensure that those funds are available for interpreters or captioning.
If I could add to that, I just want to share an idea that I have been working on. I live in a city on a small island on the other side of the water, and I've been talking with one of the council members there about...
You're talking about Mercer Island?
No. I'm talking about Bainbridge Island. And we are trying to establish an accessibility fund that the city would put maybe $5,000 into each year, and then if somebody was having an event that they needed to, say, hire interpreters, they could draw on that. And if the money didn't get spent, it would roll over into the next year. And if it kept not getting spent, then you could do something really big, like a hearing loop, which would be wonderful. So that's just a thought if anybody else wants to work on something like that.
Hi there. My name is Patty. I'm an Asian woman, and I use a sign language interpreter. When you were talking about how big an impact you can have, so the point is, hire people with disabilities and pay them well so they can afford to live here, they can afford to do everything they want to do, they can advocate to remove barriers. So, you know, a lot of times people don't have the freedom to get married because they're afraid of losing their SSDI. And so, you know, just as an example, so if you're thinking about how to invest, it's not just in investing in disability organizations, it's investing in disabled people working in those organizations at all levels and paying them well to do the good work. And they can influence the policies, the access, and everything else we need. And so, if, like you said, 1 in 4 people has a disability. So where are they? Let's get the ball rolling. Let's get them into these positions. Let's get them paid. It'll be good for everyone.
Right on.
I think one of you mentioned internalized ableism, especially during school years. And I was wondering if you all could talk a little bit about your experience with internalized ableism.
How much time do we have, Kara?
Rock, paper, scissors. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because I feel like that's a continuous process of wrestling with that demon. I happen to be like a really competitive person, and that really manifested in school. And I remember being in Spanish 2 class, and I was in the same class as the valedictorian. And so I really wanted to do better in Spanish than Brad Hayward. I'm calling him out. And I remember that I got like a half a point higher than Brad Hayward on the midterm. And I just felt like that was the best thing. But then it just kind of evaporated. So what I've had to kind of unlearn around that is, yeah, I can maybe get those victories, hollow as they are. Brad Hayward doesn't care anymore. That was like a long time ago. But you get through different stages of life and you think, I got this. And I have to say that in terms of being a working disabled person now, that I am in a role where I'm in executive leadership. And I've been in this role for about 1.5 years. And I have felt some re-emerging ableism inside of myself, like, how did I get here? Now I can answer that question, but we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. But it's funny how you think you've got this stuff under control, and then something good happens to you, like, oh, I'm in leadership now, that's a good thing. But then I'm like, okay, but what if I don't deliver? What about this? What about that? And then I have to like reevaluate and then lean into my relationships. And I do have people from my team here tonight, which I really appreciate. And I have good enough relationships with those folks that I can say that and know that it's not going to be weaponized against me. But I'm figuring out. It's day to day. Elections have a funny way of kind of re-emerging a lot of that stuff too. So, I mean, I'd have to pay you money as a therapist to go much deeper than that tonight. But I really appreciate you kind of lifting that idea up to talk about. Thank you.
So I grew up in a family of 3 older brothers, and I was expected to keep up with the conversation at the dinner table. And I'm a lip reader, so I had to keep up. So I had to pretend a lot and just kind of pretend that I knew what was going on instead of asking for help and say, hey, slow down. Much different now. I'm like, shut up, wait. But back then, I felt like I wasn't allowed to ask for help. Like even now, asking for captioning sometimes makes me uncomfortable. Because I'm a good lip reader. Why should I have to ask for help? Why should I have to make other people pay for this? So that is the type of thing that goes through my head sometimes. But I've worked through it. I'm more self-aware now. I have mostly more compassion for myself. And I think this is true for any person with a disability, is you have to give yourself a break and think about, as an expression, how many spoons you have to get through the day. And I grew up in a family that was very ambitious, very motivated, and so I felt like I had to be like that, and I still am like that, but now I can say, okay, you know, I'm tired. I've been in 5 meetings, lip reading in 5 meetings, I'm going to take a break. So giving myself permission to really listen to those feelings has been important.
I have another question. Also, I guess like a reflection based off of like what I've heard. I think like, sorry, I feel like if I hold it, it's a little bit. So, I think that like we live in a society that values like being convenient, and I think like when you guys say like being more accessible increases the quality of life for people who like don't have disabilities, like I really do feel that, because it's allowing a lot more people to just have space to just exist and not be convenient for society. So that's my reflection off of what you guys said. Another question that I have is, what were the most unique, creative workarounds to still provide accessibility for a need that you guys ever seen?
What a great question. I need a minute to think on that.
It's a great question.
Yeah.
Should we take another question while you ponder?
This might be a cheap answer, but what does come up for me is a book that I read a long time ago called No Pity, which is written by Joseph Shapiro, who is a NPR reporter who has done a lot of reporting on the disability community. And he has a section of the book that focuses in on technology and how a lot of technology has been put forth as an accommodation or as a creative workaround for disability, but then it gets integrated into society. So typewriters, for instance, were originally created to create Braille documents. And then people figured out, oh, well, you could also do this for written words as well. So it got, instituted more broadly. So that's the kind of thing that I think is like, I have little workarounds that I have in my home. Like I have little grabbers mounted all over my condo. So if I drop something, I can take one of those grabbers and pick whatever I dropped up off of the floor. That's not really an interesting example. Typewriters are much more interesting. But I would just lift that up as like, sometimes the creativity is right in front of us.
I think also to speak a little bit to the reflection you were having there about like convenience, I think a word that I hear a lot that I've been seeing in the news today is efficiency. And there's like this obsession with things being efficient. But I think there really is space to just experience things how they happen, right? It doesn't have to be efficient or fast or whatever it is. So I think that there's something there. And then I think also when it comes to like accommodations and things, again, I always go to the preservation angle. When places aren't physically accessible, there's a lot of leaning into technology now. There's like virtual reality, video tours, all of those things, which is an accommodation, but I think when we're talking about preservation and places, like the place itself is important, and getting there and experiencing it is important, not on a computer screen. So kind of both minds on that one.
This is not exactly a workaround, but it sort of is, but it's an organization that I've come to really respect as an organization that values accessibility, and they use a lot of creativity to make accessibility work for their patrons. And it's an organization called Sound Theater Company, and they do access seating, and they do they have people with disabilities on staff and on the board and as actors. They have relaxed rehearsal. So the rehearsals are not driven by time. It's driven by the actors. If they need to take a break, they take a break, and the rehearsal resumes when everyone is ready. They have a radical ticket pricing system where you pay what you can, and so they have a lot of different workarounds to get people, anyone, to come to their shows and be able to access those shows, no matter what background you're from.
Hello, thank you all for your talks. Learned a lot. I was wondering if you could talk about some examples of cross-disability organizing. I know we kind of touched on this a little bit, but in your experience.
My experience around cross-disability organizing was around campus experiences at the University of Washington, and perhaps more recently, Colin could maybe address what his experiences were like at University of Oregon, but places like colleges, universities, places of education are natural gathering spots for diverse people, and that is where I had the most clarity around having that kind of contact.
I feel like the best example of that is the movie Crip Camp, where you have a bunch of campers with disabilities coming in to a summer camp and organizing around that.
It's on Netflix, Crip Camp, and it features Judy Heumann, who is widely regarded as being the mother of the modern disability rights movement. Sadly, we lost her in 2023, but she wanted to be a teacher and took on activism in order to embrace that dream. And a lot of groovy stuff happens at disability camp, for sure.
I feel like that was a perfect encapsulation of the disability rights movement.
Yes.
It's really exciting to see the history of disability activism in Seattle being surfaced. And it sounds like we have a 200-page document that we can all read. But I wonder if you have thoughts about how that story can be told, and in what forms you might see that happening.
I'll jump on into that. My role happens to be with the Department of Neighborhoods, and we spend a lot of time centering community. And it strikes me that while we are representative of the disability community, we are not representative of the community at large. We do not have people of color on our panel, or at least none of us have identified as being people of color. So I think that naturally is a place that we need to go, is a lot of disability activism, I think, has a bit of a white appearance to it. And we really do need to look at intersectionality and how other communities and cultures address disability and what solutions they have that are really great, that we can welcome into our community as well.
You said it beautifully.
I talk too much, I'm sorry.
All right, last chance for a question.
Thank you all so much for sharing tonight. I just wonder, in these next several years, if you have any advice on how to stay motivated in your own disability activism.
Burnout is real. It's really real, and it's something I've been struggling with for the last couple of years, in fact, because sometimes it's a lonely road that you have to travel on. And I know that there's lots of people out there fighting the good fight, but it does get tiring after a while. But there's certain things that keep me going. You know, it's convenings like this. It's programs that take place that really center people with disabilities. It's the questions that get asked. It's the light bulb moments. So every one of those positive things gets put back into my bank so that I'm really renewed and refreshed.
For me, it's about seeking joy. It's not just about the activism. The activism is what supports my search and my attainment of joy. I love being alive. I love being part of the community. I love Korean dramas. One of my goals is to get to South Korea one day. Those things matter to me. Activism matters to me too. But it's not just activism for the sake of activism. It's because of what it opens up for me and for others. And that's what allows me to stay energized, because if we just look at where we are and where we could be, we run into looking at what we don't have. And that will most definitely lead to burnout, like Elizabeth was saying. So follow your bliss and let that affirm you.
Thank you so much. Let's give a round to all of our speakers.
Good job, good job, good job.
And also to our partners at the Seattle Department of Neighborhoods.
Yay!